Well, thank you all for coming. Today we're going to have a wonderful review of what took place locally in a portion of our population with the AIDS epidemic. But I wanted to just frame the historical context of what we're going to talk about. 35 years ago in 1981 was the first report through the MMWR, through an EIS officer working at the CDC, Dr. Wayne Shandera, who reported the first 4 or 5 cases out of Los Angeles of what they thought at that time was an immunodeficiency syndrome with pneumocystis infection in 4 or 5 gay individuals in Los Angeles. And this was the first report. And over the next 35 years, we've seen the dissemination of this infection both locally, nationally, and internationally around the world. Dr. Shandera actually joined our faculty shortly after that and has been on our faculty in the Infectious Disease Division of the Department of Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine in Ben Taub, where he has been taking care of AIDS patients throughout his time at Ben Taub. So I wanted to give him some recognition for being one of the first reporters of this particular entity. We've come a long way since then. There are now 1.3 million people living with HIV in the United States. 1 in 5 are unaware that they're infected at the time. Every 9.5 minutes, someone is infected with HIV in the United States. African Americans make up only 13% of the population, but account for 82% of the new HIV cases. And young gay and heterosexual, bisexual black men are the most severely affected subpopulation of HIV infection now. There are over 27,000 individuals known living with AIDS in the Houston community and Harris County. Every 9 hours, someone presents in Houston infected with HIV. And again, we see this not only in the gay community, but in the heterosexual community of Houston and Harris County. So from those initial cases, it came to Houston, it came to Harris County, and many individuals in the healthcare community have spent the last 35 years trying to unravel how to diagnose it, treat it, and prevent it. And one of the leaders in that particular quest is Adan Rios, and we've invited Dr. Rios here to talk about his experiences, how he got involved with the HIV patients and the epidemic that spread, and his personal recollections of different things that happened over the past 30 years. But before we do that, I just want to ask you to just tell the group a little bit about, you came from Panama, you were trained in Panama, a little bit about your background and how you ended up coming to Houston and MD Anderson Hospital.
Well, good morning, and thank you for coming to this meeting. My wife never thought that anybody wanted to listen to my stories. She has to do it at dinner. But I was graduated from the University of Panama, and there were 2 programs in the United States where you could be recognized as a specialist in medicine or any of the classical subspecialties, which include surgery, orthopedic, GYN and obstetrics, and internal medicine, outside the mainland of the United States. Those 2 programs were the American Hospital in Paris and Gorgas Hospital in the Canal Zone, which now has ceased to exist as the Canal Zone became now part of the Republic of Panama. That program started in the early 1900s with the construction of the canal, and it was devoted mostly to the development of the treatment of tropical and infectious diseases, malaria, yellow fever, which were essential for the sanitation of the area where the canal was made. Then with the Second World War, there were more casualties due to infectious and tropical disorders. Malaria was one of the main. So Gorgas Hospital became one of the hubs to the study of malaria and yellow fever and tropical diseases. So there was a long tradition of study of tropical diseases in Panama and the United States, and a great collaboration, one that I sorely miss and I wish would be rekindled somehow. Many of the tropical disease experts in this nation spent time in Panama receiving that kind of training. We remember common friends, the other Carl Johnson, who studied all the hemorrhagic fevers of South America and was very essential in developing drugs such as ribavirin for the treatment of some viral diseases, which are still being used today. So I went to Panama, to Gorgas Hospital almost by accident, truly, because I happened to be president of the Medical Society of Students in Panama during a military coup. Everybody who was in any leadership position was placed in blacklisted, and I couldn't get a job. And there was a doctor, which many of you hopefully will remember, Dr. Carlos de Castro, who's a cardiologist. So somebody told me they're looking for a physician at Gorgas because somebody has left the position because he didn't like the heat. And they were really desperately looking for a resident in internal medicine. And I have passed my ECFMG test by accident, but I had passed it and I had my certificate. And so I went there and I met with Dr. de Castro. And Dr. de Castro was a typical American man, blonde, blue eyes, with his military uniform and so on. And my English was not that great. So I sat there and he said, "What do you want?" And I started, and suddenly he said, "Chico, ¿tú qué quieres?" And he said, "What do you want?" in perfect Spanish. And I said, "Oh my God, you speak Spanish?" He said, "Yeah, I'm from Puerto Rico." My parents are from Spain, and that's why I'm blonde, but I'm from Puerto Rico. I speak, what do you want? I said, "Well, I need a job." And he said, "Okay, we're looking for somebody." Look at the papers. And he asked me when you can start. And I said, "Right now." And that was it. That's how I entered into that magnificent program. I got to meet this program was run by the Pentagon. And it took care of all the armed forces, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Marines. And it was, all the astronauts will go there for jungle training. So this was a great program. And every 3 months they will bring somebody from a major medical school for 4 or 5 days to give lectures. So I got to see some of the great stars of American medicine and spend time with them at close range. Just at the vignette, I saw Dr. Benjamin Castleman actually do a clinical pathological conference at Gorgas, and I was just sitting there thinking, this is the guy that writes this every week in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so Dr. Evan Hirsch came to visit. He was at the time working in melanoma. And,
From MD Anderson Hospital.
From MD Anderson, yeah. And I was really interested in oncology at the time, and I talked to him, and we made connection, and that's how I came to Anderson train. And then I went back to Panama to, of course, change the world. I was going to organize cancer in Panama because they didn't know what they were doing. And I remember when I got back, Dr. Cornel Anderson, who was the head of Gorgas, he told me, he said, "If things don't work in Panama, just come back to Gorgas. We'll be happy to have you again." And I remember telling him, I said, "Oh no, we're going to do a cancer institute, and it's going to be great, but thank you anyway." Well, 1 year later, I was knocking on his door saying, "Well, nothing worked," and I went back. So I went back to Gorgas, and that's when the whole thing started, because I was already trained, and in a military hospital like that, you will see infectious diseases, tropical diseases, and trauma, people who will have accidents and so on. But cancer is very rare in a military base like that. And even though they have populations sometimes up to 40,000 active members there, I was really sort of sitting there thinking like, well, here I am with all this training, and what am I going to do? And suddenly, the head of cardiology told me, said, "Hey, tomorrow you have to be here at 2 o'clock on time. A friend of the ambassador is sick, and I want you to see him." And I said, okay. So I went there. Then they took me to a room, and there was generals and colonels and all, and there were two persons that I knew they didn't belong in Panama. They looked like Bostonians, and I could tell just by the way they look. They look very flush with the heat. And one was Dr. Benjamin King from Cornell, a very famous professor in tropical medicine, and the other one was Leroy Hubbard, who was the dean of the University of California at Irvine. And what happened is that the Shah of Iran had been accepted to be brought to Panama. And they were looking for an oncologist. I happened to be the only American trained oncologist. I was working for the Department of Defense of the United States, so it was almost like a perfect match. And I undertook that task of taking care of him for about 3 months and a half. That's another story for another time, but only just to illustrate how sometimes the road less traveled of the poet Robert Frost worked, because when the Shah left to Egypt, I went back again to source of a vacuum of opportunity. But by then, Dr. Freira called me and said, come back to Houston, come back to MD Anderson. And when I came back, they didn't have a position because I came back in the middle of the year. So he said, you know what, why don't you help Dr. Mansell and Newell? They're working with this very funny disease. We don't know much about it, but why don't you get involved with them? And then next year we'll get you organized. And that's how maybe it's the time to, that's how my beginning in AIDS began. And I accepted that task of these 6 months with Dr. Newell and Mansell almost as an interlude into my real career in melanoma. And 30 years later, I'm still at it. And so it just shows that sometimes that's the way life works. So that's how I ended up getting involved in HIV, because they were starting. This was 1982 when I came. I saw my first patient at MD Anderson in 1982.
And the people you worked with were predominantly looking at issues related to immunology, and
yes,
after these reports.
After the first reports in 1980,
81,
Dr. Evan Hirsch, who was working in immunology, made contact with Dr. Newell, who was in cancer prevention. And in those days, 40% of the patients will develop a malignancy, 60% will develop an infectious illness. And so there was, in cancer, there has been always this connection between viral disorders, immunodeficiency, and cancer. There has been this sort of triangle that people circle around, and all our models of cancer in animals are based on viral illnesses. And here is this situation where human beings were becoming infected by a virus, and very shortly thereafter, at least at the time was the perception, they were developing a malignant process. So there was an intrigue about this human model of carcinogenesis. I think essentially is what it is. And Dr. Hirsch really grabbed the opportunity and forced the work in the institution, even though at the time, most of the patients, as Dr. Greenberg says, were from segments of society that were somewhat marginated at the time: gay men, homosexual men, IV drug users. And then there were the hemophiliacs that belonged to a sort of class on their own. And so we start studying these patients, studying their immunology, and that was really part of the development work.
And you were tasked with taking care of a lot of the patients who had this Kaposi sarcoma at the time.
One of the things that happened at the time is that we separated the work, and then the infectious disease people took care of the infectious complications. I was involved with the Kaposi sarcoma and lymphomas. And we saw an incredible amount of complications related to immune disorders, and then unusual manifestations of this tumor. Let me put in perspective the question of Kaposi sarcoma. This is a malignancy that is not entirely unknown to the medical community. It was described in 1872 by a Hungarian dermatologist named Moritz Kaposi, and bear his name. And often occurs in the lower extremities, is very indolent, and most institutions will see very few cases in a year. In the United States, at Anderson, at the time that I was training there, you will see maybe 3 to 4 cases a year. And often the dermatologists will appoint a patient to come at the beginning of this training session so the trainees could see one, because you needed to see only one in your career to have a sense of how the disease works. When people talk about epidemic KS, just to give you an idea, I was seeing probably 20 to 30 cases a day steady for several years. And that's how eventually we developed this source of understanding of how the disease presented and treatments and so on, because the experience that we were forced into by the epidemic was monumental. So we will see 30 to 40 cases of Kaposi sarcoma a day. There was a fraction of those cases that will have other complications like primary CNS lymphoma, B-cell lymphomas, but the bulk of the patients will have Kaposi sarcoma. And then in infectious diseases, and I hope the slide will have it, most of the complications were oral thrush, which is the first slide to your top right, and then in the middle, the king of the complication was pneumocystis carinii, and then the other viral disease that we saw in large quantities was CMV, and the most dramatic and tragic manifestation was CMV retinitis. We will see odd manifestation of herpetic diseases. That's the slide in the middle, the man in the middle. We will also see very unusual presentations of infections in the brain. This is a man with polymicrobial abscess. And then another devastating complication was, you can see the brain at the bottom. That brain has very large ventricles. These patients will have a very quick destruction of their brains, and they will become essentially, at 26 years old, Alzheimer patient. They will lose absolute control of their neurological function. So you have young people who were blind, who were behaving like Alzheimer's disease, who have this covered with these lesions of Kaposi sarcoma, terribly immune suppressed with significant amount of infectious complications, for most of which there was no treatment. In the early days of 1980, pneumocystis carinii was considered to be an orphan disease, and the only drug that was available was pentamidine. Now, to get pentamidine, you have to write to the CDC, send the diagnosis of the case, they will write you back, and then 4 or 5 days later, you will get the pentamidine. By then, most of those patients will be on a ventilator, and most of them will die of the disease. Now, picture the arch from those days to today, when you can prevent the disease with 1 tablet of Bactrim a day. So in 1982, 83, 84, we had floors at MD Anderson, and there were other hospitals, but I'm just talking about my experience, what I saw, that you will walk into the floor and you will see 10, 15 ventilators in 2 or 3 floors of MD Anderson. And all those ventilators will be young persons with pneumocystis carinii who you knew were going to die, essentially.
So we were at that point in time, we didn't know what was causing it until when?
Well, I think one of the points that you bring with this comment, which is so fundamental, is that there were 3 emotions or 3 factors that were governing how we reacted to this epidemic. I think the most intense one was fear. And the fear came because now we know that if a person gets infected with HIV, it will take some time for the immune system to become to that point where truly the person will be subject to these complications. And what we were seeing at the time was the tail of the first wave of the epidemic. So these were all these patients who have been infected in the 60s and 70s who now were at the tail of the untreated natural course of the disease. And of course, they were all having these complications. But you don't know that. So all that you know is that in major cities of this country and throughout the world, but in major cities of this country, in the emergency room, young people were coming in hordes with these terrible complications that almost appeared to have come out of the blue, which was not the case, but that's how they presented. So the thought that there was a virus or an agent, probably a transmissible agent, that could very quickly devastate your immune system was something that almost paralyzed us at all. I don't know what prompted me to engage in the treatment of these patients. Either it was that I really thought that they were going to give me something to do at the end of the 6 months, or I wasn't totally aware of what I was doing. Because the fear is, it was, in 1983 when Dr. Montagnier and Gallo said it is a virus, and everybody knew that most likely was going to be a transmissible agent, I was certain that I had been infected. I felt, because you get needle sticks, you manipulate patients and this and that, so I was just convinced that when I saw the news like it is a virus, I thought, well, okay, they tricked me. They told me 6 months, and now I'm a gunner. So, but at the end of the day, I felt that there was, and I will say this with kindness, and I'm speaking only for myself, but at the time I felt compelled to do what I thought I had sworn to do, which is just to take care of people. And
I think your feelings were not uncommon from the medical profession. Even the medical profession responded in different ways. Like yourself, we have to take care of these patients, and some of the profession tried to keep from taking care of the patients as well.
This was a very difficult, these were very difficult times, and I think that we were tested in ways that probably teach us hard lessons that we learned at the time. I tell you once, just a story. I remember a man that was a colleague, and he was very difficult to deal with because he had to provide ancillary services to these patients. And at the time, we were just a handful, Dr. Mansell, Dr. Newell, Dr. Hollinger, and I apologize if I left anybody out of the crew, Dr. Grimes. It was a handful of people really who were involved in this. And I remember that I would go with one of my patients and I would say, look, we need a CAT scan of this patient. And they will left the patient in the hall waiting until everybody had their CAT scan. So sometimes it will be 7, 8 o'clock at night. And then they will wash the room, they will tell the patient that because of him, we need to clean up this room and throw this bleach. And you can imagine how these patients will feel. It was really difficult. I always had a hard time with him because he was also very open in his feeling about the situation at Anderson, and he will not make bones in letting me know how he felt about it. Enough said to say that I still remember with great surprise when I was working in the community. One day I walked out into the clinic, and our clinic in the community was a clinic of AIDS patients, mostly still gay men from Montrose and from other areas of Houston. And the nurse came and said, there is a doctor who wants to visit with you. And I walked out and it was him. And I thought like, wow, I thought I have left this man behind. And I thought that maybe there was something wrong. And I said, hi, how are you? I'm surprised to see you here. And he said, well, can I talk to you in private? And I said, sure. And he said, downstairs in the parking lot is my son. He has AIDS. And what can you tell? What can you say? And
but these stories,
I just went ahead and told him, don't worry, tell him to come, we'll take care of him, there's no problem. And we now see each other every so often. He has changed dramatically in his perception of the illness. Dr. Hunter is there, took care of so many of these women. Women with HIV, in my books, even if she had sex one time with the man she loved, she will be ostracized and treated that as the scum of the earth. And that is such a difficult thing because these women didn't have anybody who would treat them as human beings, who will look at them and not pass judgment. It was really, it's one of the most difficult aspects is dealing with women with HIV.
So from 83 through 86 and 7, there was a lot of things happening in the field with the detection of the virus, coming up with a test to say whether you were infected, the beginnings of the initial antiviral therapies with AZT. Tell us a little bit how the Institute for Immunologic Diseases got started and your role there.
And I will tell you something, you all must have noticed that I got a little bit shook up because I believe, and I'm fine now, but I think that we all that went through those times, we have post-traumatic stress syndrome. I know that.
So this is part of the therapy. Tell us about the...
It's therapeutic, but it's just under the surface.
Yeah.
I don't talk much about it, but when I get back to those times,
Yeah, it was very difficult for everybody taking care of it.
So we became, at the time, the rule was education. That was the only way you could survive. And Dr. Sam Nixon with the Harris County Medical Society put this program where this book was made. It was called HIV and AIDS, A Guide for Survival. This was really like a booklet, a ticket to how to keep yourselves protected and sane. And it was a really everyday language description of how to protect yourself. The book eventually was translated to Spanish. It was really one of the greatest things that millions of copies distributed worldwide. This was quite an accomplishment. And yes, again, it shows you sometimes we look at medicine and we feel that in order to be successful or to do something meaningful, we need to have some kind of sophisticated equipment that costs $500,000. When at the end of the day, maybe just doing the proper education or bringing clean water, you can change, have tremendous impact. And I think that where you pick and choose your battles, particularly for the young people who are looking at healthcare and sometimes can get distracted by this pressure about technology and so on. And simple things, wash your hands, this still is one of the major main things. So this was really what appeared to be a simple effort in the middle of such a tremendous health crisis, and I believe had an enormous impact. And the leader of that effort was Dr. Sam Nixon, who we remember. So as the program grew at MD Anderson, I found later, I was talking with Dr. Greenberg, and we were reflecting on this, many of the cancer centers in the nation were loaded with AIDS patients. Memorial in New York, City of Hope in California, MD Anderson. And the reason was because of the KS and the lymphomas, and then the fact that in cancer centers, you deal with infectious disease and in immune-suppressed patients. So it was almost like a natural draw for the patients. Most of these centers were highly concerned about the volume of AIDS patients. And there were essentially three reasons. One is, it is a virus, and even though the transmissibility of the virus had been worked out as being as hepatitis B, blood and sex, there were all these theories floating around. What happened if you can transmit it by aerosol? Now you have all these patients with these viruses sitting in between patients who are immune suppressed because of chemotherapy. The second thing was that since we still didn't have effective therapy for these complications, who is going to pay for all these ventilators? I mean, you have all these people requiring all this high-intensity care in addition to the regular population of patients. And then the third concern was most of these patients were gay men. Some of them which were at the time on the margins of society. So I think there was this mixture of factors led to movements in different ways to try to organize the care of the patient. We applied for what is called the 8 Treatment Evaluation Unit, and this is Dr. Guy Newell, who was the head of the Public Health Department at MD Anderson, Cancer Prevention, Dr. Evan Hirsch, who was my mentor, head of the Biological Therapy, Dr. Blaine Hollinger, who was at Baylor, Dr. James Rubin, who's still at MD Anderson, he's an expert in immunology and flow cytometry. So the grants were put up by the NIH. There were 9 grants throughout the country. There was to centralize the diagnosis and treatment of HIV, and that was the first national concerted effort to deal with the epidemic as such. And we applied, and we got the grant, and the grant was about $5 million. So one of the works that has came out from that effort that has been highly cited through medical literature was this paper about the characterization of the immunological condition of these patients. And with the grant came the opportunity to do some more work. And then comes the nuances of the situation, because we were told, well, why don't we create your own institute? And wouldn't that be nice? You can do your own research and so on. And, you know, it's so appealing, so attractive, but the institute was placed about 3 hours, at least an hour and a half from MD Anderson. And so we were away from the medical center. And so we thought that probably, in retrospect, maybe that was a measure to get the patients out of the medical center. They should have stayed here. This was a very controversial time. That was a very controversial decision. But nonetheless, the institute went on. It was a private and university effort. The first one, activity between university and the private sector, had been the Humana Heart Institute in Kentucky. And it was between the University of Utah and Humana. Dr. DeVries went there to do cardiac transplant. So that was seen as a model that maybe we can replicate with AIDS, have an institute where the private sector and a university collaborate. And that led to the creation of the first institute for treatment of AIDS patients. It was a general hospital called Citizen Hospital. It's close to the airport. A very nice facility, as you can see. There were some long hours working there, but there were also some creative effort. I mean, you can see a patient there in this picture with his IV trying to do exercise. We were working against trying to understand better the fatigue associated to HIV disease. And that's, as you can see, that was the institute. We had all the wherewithal to do the work that we needed to do. And very seminal work was initiated there, particularly work with ACT and some other experimental agents that were developed at the institute. But the institute was ahead of its time, and eventually it closed its doors. It was a very traumatic event, because then we had to take all these patients and redistribute it again through Houston. And it was distributed based on a tier. Those who have insurance went to private institutions. And there were 2 hospitals in Houston that really took most of those patients with insurance. And, you know, this was not a matter that because they have insurance, these hospitals they did this almost against the will of the community, and were Park Plaza Hospital and 12 Oaks. And then the ones who did not have insurance, there was an outcry. Lieutenant Governor Hobby created a commission, and Gib Lewis was the Speaker of the House. And that commission was created because the NIH got very upset that the institute had been closed and that the money had been returned. And so they created a committee that investigated why the institute had been closed. And there was a lot of animosity and discussion. And eventually MD Anderson, I think, in a compromise that everybody agreed that this population needed to have some form of care, that it could not be left to their own, decided to take the Thomas Annex, which was used for cancer patients that didn't have where to stay, and that became Thomas Street Clinic, which is truly today a magnificent place.
So just to add a little detail to that.
Yeah, please do.
So since I was involved with that transaction, it actually was a trade. MD Anderson had the old railroad hospital in Thomas Street building, and Harris County Hospital District had a piece of land right at the corner of Holcomb and the cross street from MD Anderson. So MD Anderson wanted that piece of territory that the Harris Health had, and they switched. So Harris Health got the Thomas Street Hospital that they opened for AIDS patients, and MD Anderson got that piece of territory, which I think now is an MRI machine, an outpatient MRI machine.
Correct.
But so it was a land swap that both parties wanted to have happen.
I think another perhaps historical impact of these events is that everybody has their eyes in the country when it was announced that there was an AIDS hospital in Houston. The whole nation put its eyes on Houston. Houston was known for cardiovascular disease, all the medical center. People said, my God, AIDS is going to be resolved. These people, the Texans are after it. And I think that there were news in the New York Times, there was broad coverage. Of course, the closure was also covered by the New York Times. And if you notice, the reporter is Peter Applebaum. He's a very well-known reporter now, senior reporter for the New York Times. He was very young. He was sent to do this interview to Houston. We talk about all the issues about AIDS. I remember telling him, I said, we talk about the Nazi Holocaust, we talk about the Cambodian Holocaust. Maybe this is a different kind of Holocaust, and somehow we're going to have to deal with it. So when the hospital closed, when the institute closed, the news spread like wildfire throughout the nation. And people who were thinking that perhaps this was a way to resolve problems in their community immediately said, an AIDS hospital, you don't touch it with a proverbial 500 pole, because look what happened in Houston. And so I think there was a ripple effect that we will never be able to find out what it meant in terms of the impact of closing that institute in the ways that it was closed. And so that's just my personal view of the issue, but I think that it just indicates that sometimes these things all these events don't happen in a vacuum, and they do have consequences. There are consequences.
But out of the closure, how did that affect you and what you ended up doing?
Well, there was a group of physicians here, Gordon Crawford, Ben Balfrey, Gary Bruton, and then Estul and Yogat, who were in the community. They were just a handful, and they told me, they said, what are you going to do? And let me tell you how desperate sometimes you get. I remember seeing Dr. James Holland, who is a very famous oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering, at the airport, and I was dropping somebody at the airport, and I saw him, and I went to him and I said, Dr. Holland, I know who you are, because you are a good friend of Dr. Emil Frater, my mentor, and I'm looking for a job. And he just looked at me like, who is this? You want to interview here at the airport? And I said, no, it's just that, they closed the AIDS hospital. And he says, oh, you were at that place? And I said, yes, and he said, well, listen, come to New York, because my wife, Jimmy Holland, has just opened the first psychiatric unit for care of AIDS patients. We'll take you with open arms, this and that. But then I felt scared, because I go like, I don't know New York, and I mean, this was a real traumatic event. This thing was really, but I joined the community of physicians that were working, and then I decided to, because of the grant left, we essentially were left, Houston were left without support at the time. And all the contacts with the federal government were lost. This was really a very difficult situation. I know that there were some hearings in Congress in Washington where Dr. Fauci was questioned about why you don't have an AIDS program in Texas. They are the third or fourth largest city with AIDS patients. And he had a hard time explaining what had happened. He came to Houston a couple of times to try to negotiate the ATU. Those negotiations failed. So this was not good for us in that regard. And so all the adult grants left. And of course, future applications were viewed with suspect because you already have returned money, and so why would you ask for more money now? And so I decided to try to organize a conference where we will keep contact with the forefront of HIV. And then I have met Dr. Luc Montagnier at the Institute. He came to visit the Institute with Dr. Mansell very briefly, but we met and we exchanged cards and we exchanged phones. So I called him and I told him, look, the Institute is closed. He was very upset. He was very angry. And he said, how can I help you? I said, well, listen, Dr. Montagnier, we're trying to do a conference to stimulate that the people who were working with us continue to work with us in the community. And he says, when is the conference? I said, it's on a Thursday. He said, okay, it takes a whole day from Paris, but I'll be there. And Thursday at 8 o'clock he came, and we inaugurated the first conference on AIDS in America by Dr. Luc Montagnier in 1989, just merely 4 years after the virus had been discovered. And I will tell you, I will always be grateful to Dr. Montagnier because we all know that at the time he was riding a wave by which his schedule, his commitments, the places that won him were not places where, these were not community programs. These were like all the major universities of the world were after him because of his discovery. But he came to Houston, inaugurated the conference. We were about 250 persons in the audience. But he gave his lecture, left the next day to Paris, and that was the beginning of this conference. This conference had a run of about 11 years. We dedicated the first conference to AIDS in the workplace, and we brought experts from California because the major issue was the protection of the patients and anybody who was suspect to have HIV from the ways to earn their living, because people were fired left and right without any hesitation. And so the conference grew up. By the 11th year, we were holding the conference at the George R. Brown Convention Center. The average attendance was in the range of thousands. We have exhibits from the pharmaceutical companies. This became like a major source of information for the community, and we have some of the greatest minds in HIV come through. Dr. Hunter was a regular speaker at the conference in HIV and pregnancy and prevention of childhood HIV. Dr. Gatt, Dr. Salvato, Dr. Mark Weinberg, who was president of the International AIDS Society, gave some of his first lectures here in Houston about the use of spermicides and prevention. He just recently was at CFAR talking about his work with integrase inhibitors. And so we really had the opportunity. One thing that we did, which was interesting, is because this was a community program, we will have physicians and patients in the same room. And the conferences were tailored to the community. And so after the conference, there will be always half an hour between the speaker and the patients. And so that's how we learn about things. Martin Delaney from Project Inform was one of the first ones who brought to Houston information about Buyers Club. And that's how Buyers Club got into the community of Houston. And I remember bridging patients who were into Buyers Club drugs to then the regular combinations of therapy and providing the opportunity for them to survive. The Houston Names Project became very active, and they brought the actual quilt that was in California, and they displayed it at the George R. Brown Convention Center. This is one quilt for each person that is dead. At its peak, the quilt covered the whole Washington Mall. One day they did an exhibit, and it was a civil march demanding new treatments for HIV. It covered the whole Washington Mall with the quilt. And these were part of the members of the Names Project of Houston. So the 11th conference was the last one. By then, the community had all the resources. People were doing well with heart therapy. There was no real need as such for the conference, but we still have Dr. Markowitz, who was one of the creators of triple therapy, and some of the really stars of the HIV world at the time. We had the opportunity to bring Dr. Montagnier again, and we closed the conference by giving him a Lifetime Achievement Award at the last conference. You can see the first poster of the first conference. He received the award in front of, I think, we're like 1,500 people that gave him a standing ovation. And he always, I think he always had a soft spot for Houston, because when he won the Nobel Prize, the first city he came back to the United States was Houston. He came and visited Houston and wanted to go around and see where everything was at the time. One unsung hero of the epidemic is George Foreman. George Foreman was making his comeback as a boxer. We were good friends because this is a sport that is very popular in Panama. And the institute was about 20 minutes from his gym. So he knew that there was something going on there, and he would visit periodically the hospital. And when he found out that AIDS patients were discriminated at the food bank, he called me and he said, you know, I want to do something for the food pantry. And I said, well, you know, you had to call them. He said, no, I want to make a food pantry for the AIDS patients that everybody will envy and that they want to go there. And so he gave the AIDS Foundation $250,000 and plus bought a piece of land, and they created a food pantry that looks almost like a fine Randall supermarket. And so that's where the AIDS patients started to go for their food needs. And in those years, as you know, when perhaps embracing an AIDS patient was something looked upon with some degree of difficulty by society at large, George was one of the pioneers of these open arms and embracing what we call our brothers with the disease. And one of the things he did too is there was a boxer, Tommy Morrison, nephew of John Wayne, who eventually tragically developed HIV disease. And he wanted to make some fights to make some money, and George took him and fought it on. And that was a very controversial issue, because the question was, why are you fighting this man who has HIV? This can be contaminated. And so George took the opportunity to educate people that you could get HIV through blood and sex. And I still remember at the press conference, one of the journalists says, so what is this business of fighting this man with AIDS? He said, it's very simple. He's a working man, I'm a working man, we are both working for our families. What is wrong with that? And so I think that George is truly one of the unsung heroes of the AIDS epidemic. He has been always a great supporter. And he did it at times when it was needed and when, you know, it wasn't really glamorous to do it. And probably when he didn't have the money neither. So the press was always friendly to the AIDS community. I know that it's hard to believe, but that's Mary Ellen Conway doing a report from the George R. Brown Convention Center. And so we always have support from the press. I think that when the post-HAART era began and patients started doing better, the situation changed in a significant manner. And I think one of the things that happened then was we were able to then attack another problem, which was the question of how do you deal with patients who have malignancies and who were dying because they were not being treated for fear of making their immune suppression worse. And so in collaboration between the community and MD Anderson, I was not at MD Anderson at the time. They put me there on the paper as if I were, but I really was not. I was a member of the AIDS community. But in collaboration, we were able to show for the first time that you could give high-dose intensive chemotherapy to a patient with HIV, provided you cover the treatment of the HIV disorder. And that was a seminal paper that really changed the paradigm of the treatment of patients with cancer and HIV. And you can see here what response. The patient on the right has a Burkitt lymphoma extensive. You see all that yellow portion. And then after completion of his therapy, he went into a remission, and that lasted for about 3 years. He then developed leukemia, went to Chicago. And I know because he called me that he was transplanted, and the transplant was also successful. And as you know, today we treat patients with HIV with the standard regimens of treatment.
And just to underscore, in my thinking, one of the pivotal years when I think back on the epidemic in Houston and elsewhere was 1995, when heart therapy really got disseminated. At Ben Taub in 1994, 20% of our inpatient medicine patients had AIDS, 20%. And in 1995, it was down to less than 5%. It dramatically shifted to an outpatient managed condition, but with secondary issues like new onset of cancer and other things. But it became a much more manageable. And so
a patient with HIV was 2 years. Right?
2 years. And so now, this past 20 years, from 1995, has dramatically shifted the discussion.
We went from we don't know what it is to it is a virus to we don't have treatment. We have one drug. We have two drugs. We now have too many drugs. It's amazing. The arch in a period of about 30 years.
Right.
The patent for the test of the antibody has run out. It ran out about 7 years ago. So we really have seen an enormous impact. And I think that it's one of the great success stories, but I like always to remind whoever I tell this that success story, while it is attributed to the pharmaceutical industry, to medicine, and to the effort of those who did the clinical work, it was built, like Newton used to say, we stand on the shoulders of giants. It was built on the shoulders of patients who took it to the street and demanded to be treated. And the reason they did this is because these were young people. And young people refused to die. That's basically the point. I thought that I was in control, but can feel this thing coming back again. But one of the hardest moments to me was when in the early years of ACT, you were required to have a document where you said that your patient had a bout of pneumocystis carinii, that he has survived that bout of pneumocystis carinii, and he has less than 200 CD4 count. And you had to sign that you testified that that was the case. Then they will get the ACT. Now, of course, you can imagine partners of those patients coming and saying, Jack died, I have 400, I want ACT. And you have to say, well, I can give it to you. Why? You need to have 200 and survive one episode of pneumocystis. Now, how crazy is that? And I think that some of us who went through those times, I think we still are scarred by those moments, because some of those young people, they realize how nuts this was. So anyway, just to illustrate the arch of change.
I think it's time to just give your last slide on Camus and the plague, maybe.
Yes. So, well, I wanted to, I'm closing in 2 minutes with your indulgence. Early in the going, when the Institute was about to close, I thought that if we had a vaccine in the Institute will not be closed. And I have read a paper in Science from Dr. Alan Goldstein where he was working with this peptide that he thought could be used as a vaccine. So I called him to Israel in Yom Kippur, which is really a nightmare because in Yom Kippur nobody picks up the phone. And I was able to talk to him and convince him to come to Houston. And he came to the Institute, and we started the first trial of his peptide. And I thought that that was going to save the Institute, but as you know the story now. But it put me on the road to thinking about a potential HIV vaccine. And in 2003, I came up with a method that I patented. This is the patent of the method which we're trying now to develop as an inactivated HIV vaccine. And so the top portion is a discussion at the Institute of this peptide of Dr. Goldstein that never saw the light because of multiple reasons. And then at the bottom is 30 years later, something that we were able to do, which is the inactivation of HIV with this particular method of inactivation, which we hope will become probably a way to obtain a preventive inactivated HIV vaccine. So the arch has been large, has been intense. It was the road less traveled. I never understood. I remember seeing a clip of President Kennedy taking possession as a president, and the laureate poet at the time was Robert Frost. And when I saw him, when I saw that clip, I thought, like, why would a president bring a poet to an inauguration? That was kind of weird. Now I know, because I hear sometimes, somewhere, that science and technology is for those who want to understand, but poetry is written by those who know. And so to me, when I read now The Road Less Traveled, I think I have a sense of what he meant to say. And I will leave you with this quote of one of my favorite writers, even before the AIDS epidemic, but after he became truly somebody that had insightfulness in this situation, Albert Camus, that says, nonetheless, we know that the tale we had to tell could be not one of a final victory. It could be only the record of what had to be done, and what surely will have to be done again by all who, while unable to be saints, strive their utmost to be healers. I'll thank you for your time. Feel free to send me a bill for superficial psychotherapy, group therapy, at Dr. Greenberg, which have been so kind with me through this journey. Thank you very much.
You refer to the way in which that left you with a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Can you just say a little bit more about what that was like, how it's impacted your life?
Well, this became a well-known phenomenon because what happened is that, number one, to illustrate with one example, just 2 days before one of the conferences, of the early conferences, a man came to Monroe's. Was a banker. His name was Michael Broussard. Michael Broussard was standing there on the sidewalk when a truck with some young men came. They get out of the truck, they beat him to death. And he was stabbed 28 times. He bled to death in the sidewalk. And he was a banker. He even didn't live in Monroe's. But he had to go to Monroe's because that's where gays were tolerated. So the point is that as a physician, you go to your lobby and you see all these gay patients who are terribly ill. You know what happened to Broussard, and you just have to start to put together the two. There's no way you can avoid to figure out that some of the things that were happening in healthcare of these patients were directly related to their humanity. And so I think that that's one aspect. Then the other aspect is that no matter what you do, you see this horrible situation, horrible death. You try to fight the prejudice of society. You engage in these sorts of political disputes, hierarchical disputes, where your earning capacity is threatened by your position, and then sometimes you feel that when you should have said something, you did not, and you go home with that feeling that, like, for example, I will go to this person that I told you, and how many times I felt like saying, what you're doing is wrong. But this is a person that has political influence in the institution. So you start accumulating all these things, and it was known throughout the AIDS community of physicians that there was a significant engagement in destructive behavior. And there were divorces, there was self-destructive behavior, there were suicides. People start feeling like we are bad persons because we really, no matter what we do, our patients die. We don't say what we need to say. You know, even today, as we talk about vaccination, I will tell you right now, the first time that I spoke at the NIH about inactivated vaccine was a week ago. I have 15 years doing work. It's a serious work as the work they're doing. But if the establishment says we don't believe in inactivation, then you are a zero. You become a zero.
Thank you.
I hope I answered.
Yes.